For a decade and a half, one man survived in the frozen wilderness, cut off from the rest of the world. No neighbors, no visitors, just silence and snow. But then, something changed. He began hearing strange knocks echoing across the valley, finding giant tracks in the snow where no man could have walked, and smelling a musk so strong it seeped through the cracks of his cabin walls. At first, he thought it was one creature. But one morning, through the fog, he realized it wasn't alone. A group, watching him, surrounding him. And from that day on, the mountain no longer felt like his home. It felt like theirs. Why would a hidden tribe appear after 15 years of silence? And what did they want with the only human left in their valley? You found your way here for a reason. In a world that can feel overwhelming, it's the gentle hearts that bring light. And yours is one of them. I've been living alone in these mountains for 15 years now. The Selkirk Range became my refuge after everything fell apart back in civilization. Most folks probably wouldn't understand trading a warm house and regular paycheck for a life of solitude in a hand-built cabin. But I couldn't bear the noise and complications of the world anymore. Not after Sarah. I used to work the logging crews up here, knew every trail and stand of old growth like the back of my hand. The hunting was good too. I'd supplement my income guiding wealthy clients during season. But after losing my wife to cancer, the meaningless small talk and paperwork felt like sandpaper on raw skin. I needed silence, real silence, the kind you only find above 3,000 feet when the snow dampens everything. The cabin took me that first summer to build. Nothing fancy, just squared logs chinked with moss and mud, a stone fireplace, and a metal roof to shed the heavy snows. The nearest road ends 8 miles away, which suits me fine. I cut my firewood with a crosscut saw, haul water from the creek, and run trap lines for meat and fur. The basics keep me busy enough that I don't have time for darker thoughts. My days follow the sun and seasons now. Up before dawn to check the trap lines, marten and rabbit mainly, though I'll take beaver when I find them. The pelts aren't worth much these days, but they help cover what few supplies I can't make or grow. Afternoons are for wood cutting or maintaining the cabin. Evening means writing in my journal by lantern light, recording the day's work and any changes I notice in the land around me. Some might call it a harsh life, but there's a clean simplicity to it that brings me peace. No phones ringing, no bills in the mail, no pitying looks from old friends who don't know what to say. Just the wind in the pines and the quiet work of staying alive. I've got my books, my journals, and a cheap disposable camera I use to document anything unusual I find while working my trap lines. The isolation does strange things to a man's mind if you're not careful. That's why I'm religious about the journal keeping. It forces me to stay sharp, to put my thoughts in order. Every evening I write down the temperature, weather conditions, animal sign I've seen, and any maintenance the cabin needs. The routine helps anchor me when the winters get long and dark. I make 2 supply runs a year, spring and fall, hiking out to where I keep my old truck parked. The store owner in the nearest town knows me now, doesn't try to make conversation beyond what's necessary. I stock up on ammunition, lamp oil, coffee, and whatever else I can't produce myself. Sometimes I'll grab a newspaper, though the headlines feel like they're from another world entirely. My rifle is my constant companion, an old Winchester that's taken more game than I can count. Out here, you learn to read the land like a book. Which tracks are fresh when the birds go quiet, how the air changes before a storm. Being careless means being dead, especially in winter when the temperatures drop below 0 and the snow piles deeper than a man is tall. The locals have mostly forgotten about me, I expect. Probably think I'm some kind of hermit gone feral in the high country. Maybe they're right. But I've found something up here that I lost down in the world of men. A kind of peace that comes from knowing exactly who and where you are. No pretenses, no compromises, just the daily work of survival and the quiet that follows. My life isn't for everyone. Most nights I eat alone at my rough-hewn table, watching shadows dance on log walls as the fire burns down. But I've learned that loneliness and solitude are different things. Loneliness is an ache, a hunger for what's missing. Solitude, real solitude, is more like fasting, a voluntary stepping away that clarifies what matters. Up here, everything is stripped to essentials, and that's exactly how I need it to be. The wilderness has become my closest companion over these 15 years. Every valley, ridge, and stand of timber holds memories now, places where I've sheltered from storms, spotted mountain lions at dawn, or found patches of huckleberries sweet enough to make me forget about store-bought sugar. The Selkirks aren't just mountains to me anymore. They're home in a way no four-walled house ever was. Winter transforms everything up here. The snow comes early and stays late, sometimes piling 10 feet deep by January. It changes how you move, how you think, how you survive. The valleys go quiet except for the wind and the occasional crack of a frost-split tree. Even the wolves move differently then, following the elk down to lower elevations where the snow isn't quite so deep. I've learned to read the weather like most folks read their morning paper. The way the clouds stack up against the ridgeline tells me when a storm's brewing. How the snow crystals fall, whether they're light powder or wet cement, lets me know if I need to worry about the roof. The birds and animals tell me things too. When the Clark's nutcrackers go silent and the squirrels disappear, something's usually moving through. Could be a lynx, could be a storm front. My trapline makes a rough circle, about 12 miles total if you count the side spurs. I know every bend in the creek, every lightning-struck snag, every patch of devil's club that'll tear your clothes if you're not careful. 15 years of walking the same paths means I notice even small changes. A broken branch, a turned stone, tracks that shouldn't be there. They stand out like ink on fresh snow. The trading post is my only real connection to the outside world now. It's a 2-day hike just to reach my truck, then another hour's drive down logging roads to get there. I make the trip twice a year, once in late spring after the snow melts, and again in early fall before the passes close up. The owner, Jim, has gotten used to my ways. He sets aside what I need: ammunition, lamp oil, coffee, salt, and the few other things I can't make myself. We don't waste time on small talk. Last time I was there, back in September, he tried telling me about some new development they're planning down in the valley. I just nodded and paid my bill. The world down there keeps changing, but up here, things stay mostly the same. That's how I like it. I know every sound these mountains make. The way wind sounds different moving through pine versus cedar. How a moose walking through deep snow sounds nothing like a deer. The hollow knock of a woodpecker versus the sharper rap of a branch falling. At night, I can tell if it's a great horned owl or a barred owl just by the rhythm of their calls. The predators, and I have come to an understanding over the years. I've had black bears nose around my cabin and mountain lions cross my path, but they've never given me real trouble. You learn to respect them without fearing them. I carry my rifle, sure, but in 15 years I've never had to use it on anything bigger than a coyote going after my smokehouse. My cabin sits in a natural clearing backed up against a cliff face. From my front door, I can see down the valley for about 2 miles before it bends north. The creek runs year-round, fed by springs up higher, so I never have to worry about water. I've got south-facing slopes for the garden in summer, and enough dead-standing timber nearby to keep me in firewood without having to drag logs too far. The solitude has taught me to notice things most people miss. How shadows move across the valley as the seasons change. The way snow builds up differently on pine branches versus fir. The subtle changes in air pressure before a weather system moves in. When you're alone this long, these details become your conversation, your entertainment, your calendar. Every evening, I write it all down in my journal: weather patterns, animal sign, anything unusual I've noticed. 15 years of observations fill a shelf of notebooks now. They're my record of this life I've chosen. Proof that even in complete solitude, every day brings something worth noting. I was finishing up my evening journal entry when I first heard it. The sound carried across the valley, a steady, rhythmic thumping that made me pause mid-sentence. My pencil hovered over the page as I listened. The temperature had dropped well below zero that day, and my first thought was that it was just trees popping in the cold. We get that a lot up here when the sap freezes and expands, but this was different, more regular, almost deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. Each impact seemed to come at precise intervals, maybe 4 or 5 seconds apart. I've heard plenty of trees crack in winter. They usually give one sharp report, and that's it. This kept going, steady as a heartbeat, for nearly 2 minutes before falling silent. I made a note in my journal. 21:45 hours. Unusual percussion from NW slope. Not weather-related. Investigate tomorrow if weather holds. The temperature that night dropped to 15 below zero. I stoked the wood stove before turning in, but sleep came fitfully. Every time I'd start to drift off, I'd catch myself straining to hear that thumping again. But there was nothing except the usual night sounds, wind in the pines, the occasional hoot of a great horned owl. Dawn broke clear and bitter cold. I had my trapline to check, so I strapped on my snowshoes and headed out. The snow was deep enough that even with the shoes, I was post-holing in places. The morning light caught ice crystals hanging in the air. We call that diamond dust up here. Beautiful, but it means the cold is going to stick around. The first few traps were exactly as I'd left them. But when I reached the set near Cedar Creek, something was off. The trap was sprung, but there was no catch, no sign of struggle in the snow, no blood, no fur, nothing. Just a cleanly sprung trap with undisturbed powder all around it. I've been running trap lines for decades. Animals don't just trigger traps without leaving sign. Even if something had managed to pull free, there would be tracks, disturbed snow, some indication of movement. This looked like someone had just reached down and triggered it with a stick. The next trap was the same way. And the next. 5 traps in total, all sprung clean, all surrounded by pristine snow. The only tracks in the area were mine from when I'd set them 2 days before, now partially filled in by wind-blown snow. I found myself checking over my shoulder more than usual as I finished my rounds. The diamond dust had settled, and the air was absolutely still. Sound carries strange up here when it's this cold. Sometimes you can hear conversations from over a mile away. But there was nothing. No birds, no squirrels chattering. Just that hollow winter silence that makes your ears ring. Back at the cabin, I pulled out my journal and made detailed notes about the traps. I'm methodical about my records: location, condition, any sign or tracks, weather conditions. Looking back through previous entries, I couldn't find any similar incidents. In 15 years, I'd had traps stolen by other trappers, destroyed by bears, even frozen shut. But never this. Never just cleanly sprung with no explanation. That evening, I found myself listening more intently than usual to the sounds outside my cabin. Every crack of the settling logs, every whisper of wind made me look up from my book. I told myself I was being foolish. The cold does strange things to metal. Maybe the triggers had just contracted in the extreme temperature. Maybe a pine marten had figured out how to trip them without getting caught. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Like when you walk into your home and know immediately that someone's been there. Even if nothing's obviously disturbed, the mountains felt different somehow. Less familiar. I added a final note to that day's entry. Check camera trap at Cedar Creek tomorrow. Replace sprung traps. Listen for thumping after sunset. Then I banked the fire for the night and tried to sleep, all the while straining my ears for that rhythmic pounding from across the valley. The days following the trap incident passed quietly enough, though I kept detailed notes of any unusual sounds or disturbances. By the 4th morning, fresh snow had fallen, about 8 inches of powder that turned the landscape into a blank canvas. Perfect tracking conditions. I was checking a different section of my trapline, working my way along the ridge above Moose Creek, when I stopped dead in my tracks. There, cutting across my path, was a line of impressions in the snow that made me question everything I knew about these mountains. At first glance, I thought bear. We get some big grizzlies up here. But something wasn't right. I've tracked every predator in these mountains, and this wasn't matching anything in my experience. The prints were too long, too wide for any bear I'd ever seen. And the stride. The distance between steps was enormous, easily 7 feet. I knelt down to study one of the clearer impressions. The snow was undisturbed around it, no drag marks or tail sign that you'd expect from a bear. The print itself was bizarrely human-like, 5 distinct toe marks, a broad ball and a heel, but the scale was all wrong. Using my knife handle for reference, I measured it at nearly 16 inches long and 8 inches across at the widest point. My hands were shaking slightly as I pulled out the disposable camera I keep for documenting. Interesting finds? Usually just scenic shots for my journal. I placed my knife handle next to the print for scale and snapped 2 photos. Then I took a wider shot showing the line of tracks disappearing into the timber. Standing up, I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank, though I hadn't seen another human being up here since fall. Could be a bear with some kind of deformity, though that wouldn't explain the clear toe impressions or the impossible stride length. The logical part of my brain kept searching for explanations, while another part, a more primitive part, was screaming at me to get back to the cabin. I forced myself to be methodical. In my journal, I wrote the date, time, and location, sketched the print as best I could, noting its measurements and the stride length, documented the direction of travel, northwest to southeast, and the depth of the impressions, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The tracks were fresh, no more than a few hours old based on the light dusting of snow in them. They crossed my path and continued down toward the creek bottom, where they disappeared into a thick stand of cedars. I stood there for a long time, debating whether to follow them. In the end, practicality won out over curiosity. The short winter day was already waning, and I needed to finish checking my trapline before dark, but I made a note to return the next day with more film and better measuring tools. As I continued my rounds, I found myself stepping more carefully, listening more intently. The forest felt different now, charged with a tension I'd never experienced in all my years here. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hold the possibility of something watching, something that could leave tracks bigger than any known animal in these mountains. Back at the cabin, I spent hours poring over my wildlife guides, looking for anything that could explain what I'd seen. But there was nothing. No bear, no moose, no elk could have left prints like that. I even dug out an old copy of North American Wildlife Tracks from under my bunk, but it only confirmed what I already knew. Whatever had passed through my territory that morning wasn't in any guidebook. I added one final note to my journal entry. Prints suggest biped, weight distribution and toe arrangement inconsistent with known fauna. Return tomorrow for additional documentation if weather permits. That night, I double-checked the locks on my door and windows, something I hadn't done since my first year in the mountains. As I lay in my bunk, I couldn't shake the image of those massive tracks cutting across my path, heading toward the dark heart of the valley. I spent the next few days methodically searching my territory, documenting everything that seemed out of place. What I found left me questioning whether I truly knew these mountains as well as I thought. The first discovery came when I was checking my usual deer run. The game trail that winds through a grove of young aspens had been altered, not by wind or snow, but by deliberate construction. Branches, some as thick as my forearm, had been woven between the trees to create a crude barrier about 7 feet high. The weaving wasn't random. It showed purpose, with smaller branches threaded through larger ones in a distinct pattern. This wasn't the work of fallen timber or storm damage. Something had built this. I photographed the structure from several angles, noting how fresh breaks in the wood showed it had been constructed recently. The placement was strategic too, right where the trail narrowed between 2 rock outcroppings. Almost like a funnel, I thought, though I didn't want to dwell on what might be doing the funneling. 3 days later, I found something even more unsettling near my creek. I always collect water from the same spot, where a natural pool forms behind some boulders. That morning, I noticed a change. Someone, Something had stacked river stones into 3 distinct piles. Not the random accumulation you might see from spring flooding, but deliberate towers, each about 2 feet high, arranged in a perfect triangle. The stones were sized from largest at the bottom to smallest at the top, showing clear intention. I stood there for a long time, water bucket forgotten in my hand, studying those towers. In 15 years, I'd never seen anything like this. Bears don't stack stones. Neither do elk or mountain lions. My mind kept circling back to those massive tracks I'd found, trying to connect these new signs into a pattern I could understand. But it was the smell that finally broke my nerve. It started as something I'd catch on the wind, a heavy, musky odor unlike anything I'd encountered before. Not bear, not elk, not the decay of fallen trees, or the mineral scent of snow. This was different, organic and thick, like wet fur mixed with something else I couldn't identify. At first, it would come and go with the wind, but then I began noticing it more frequently, especially at night. One evening, the smell was so strong, it woke me from a light sleep. It seemed to be coming from just outside my cabin walls. I grabbed my rifle and moved to the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The quarter moon cast weak light on the snow, but I could see nothing moving in the shadows between the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching my cabin, studying my routines just as I had studied the wildlife in these mountains for so many years. Sleep became harder to find after that. I spent more nights sitting by my window, rifle across my knees, scanning the tree line for movement. The peace I'd found in this valley, the very reason I'd chosen this life of solitude, began to feel like an illusion. The silence that had once comforted me now seemed charged with tension, broken occasionally by those distant thumping sounds that had first caught my attention. My journal entries grew longer, more detailed. I documented every unusual sound, every unexplained track or disturbance. The logical part of my mind tried to find natural explanations, but the evidence kept pointing to something else, something that moved with purpose, that built structures, that watched and waited. I found myself checking and rechecking the heavy wooden bar across my door each night. The rifle, which had mainly been used for hunting, became a constant companion. Even during daylight hours, I felt exposed when moving between the cabin and my woodpile or the creek. The valley that had been my sanctuary for 15 years now felt like someone else's territory, or something else's. The worst part was the uncertainty. In all my years of hunting and tracking, I'd never encountered anything that left signs like these. The combination of intelligence and strength suggested by the evidence went beyond anything known to inhabit these mountains. And yet, there it was, in the tracks, the structures, the stone towers, and that persistent alien smell that drifted through the night air. The weeks crawled by like wounded animals. I kept my journal close, documenting everything with an obsessiveness that would have seemed paranoid just months ago. But the signs kept mounting, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. It started with the knocks, always at dusk, when the light was draining from the sky and the shadows between the trees grew long and deep. 3 distinct sounds, not like branches falling or trees creaking in the wind. These were deliberate, knock, knock, knock. The spacing between them was too precise, too measured. I'd heard woodpeckers all my life, but this was different. The sound carried weight, like someone striking a hollow tree with something solid. The first time I heard it, I was cleaning my rifle by lamplight. The sounds came from the ridge to the east, maybe 400 yards out. I marked it in my journal. February 3rd, 6:45 in the evening. 3 knocks, eastern ridge. The Yardzis, next evening, same time, but from the western slope. Then the northern edge of my clearing 2 days later. It was as if something was working its way around my cabin, testing, watching. I started responding at first, thinking it might be another person trying to signal. I'd step onto my porch and strike my axe handle against a dead tree 3 times. The answers would come back, but never from the same place twice. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but always in that same rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. Then came the stones on my roof. The first time, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I was writing in my journal when something clattered across the tin roofing. Too light for branches, too heavy for pine cones. I rushed outside with my lantern, but found nothing except small rocks, scattered in the snow near my cabin wall. This happened 5 more times over the next 2 weeks, always at night, always when I was inside. But it was the silences that truly began to eat at my nerves. I'd spent 15 years learning the rhythm of these mountains, the constant background music of birds, wind in the pines, coyotes yipping in the distance. Now, there were moments when everything would just stop. No warning, no gradual fade. 1 second the forest would be alive with sound. The next it was like someone had thrown a heavy blanket over the whole valley. The first time it happened, I was splitting wood about 50 yards from my cabin. The silence fell so suddenly, I felt it like a physical pressure. Even the wind seemed to die. I stood there, axe half raised, listening to my own breathing and nothing else. My journal entry that night reads, February 12th, 11:30, in the morning. Complete silence lasted 6 minutes. Everything, birds, squirrels, wind, just stopped. Felt watched. These dead zones, as I began calling them in my notes, became more frequent. Sometimes they'd last only a minute or two. Sometimes, up to 15 minutes, the coyotes would cut off mid-howl. The ravens that usually croaked and squabbled in the treetops would vanish. Even the chickadees that frequented my woodpile would disappear seconds before the silence fell, as if they knew it was coming. I tried to rationalize it all. Maybe the knocks were just some weird echo effect in the valley. The stones could be falling from overhanging branches, though that didn't explain how they got up there. But the silences, those defied any natural explanation I could think of. In 15 years, I'd never experienced anything like them. My journal entries grew more detailed, almost frantic. I started noting the exact times, directions, durations of every occurrence. Pages filled with observations about weather conditions, moon phases, anything that might reveal a pattern. Some nights I'd write until my lamp ran dry, trying to make sense of what was happening to my quiet world. The rational part of my mind kept searching for explanations, but another part, the part that had spent decades reading sign and trusting instinct, was growing more certain something intelligent was out there, something that could move without leaving tracks when it chose to, something that understood patterns and timing, something that was studying me as carefully as I'd once studied the wildlife in these mountains. Found myself writing less about what I observed and more about what I felt, the weight of unseen eyes, the way the darkness seemed to press against my windows at night, the growing certainty that my years of solitude hadn't been quite as solitary as I'd believed. I couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. After another sleepless night, listening to those rhythmic knocks moving through the timber, I decided to track whatever was out there. The morning air bit sharp and clean as I shouldered my pack and rifle, leaving my cabin behind in the pale February dawn. The snow from 3 days ago gave me decent tracking conditions, though the morning sun was already softening the surface. I started where I'd heard the last knocks, on the northwestern slope about 1/4 of a mile from my cabin. The forest stood silent, except for a few chickadees working the branches overhead. Moving slow and careful, I worked my way up through the pines. 15 years of hunting these slopes had taught me every game trail and deer run, but today the familiar terrain felt different. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, more watchful. I kept stopping to listen, my breath clouding in the cold air. That's when I heard it. A branch snapping somewhere ahead, too thick to be broken by anything small. The sound echoed through the timber, maybe 200 yards up the slope. I froze, scanning the trees. Another crack, closer this time, followed by the distinct sound of something heavy moving through brush. I picked up my pace, trying to close the distance while staying quiet. But every time I got within what seemed like 100 yards, another branch would snap further ahead. It was maddening, like following a ghost that always stayed just out of sight. The thing moved fast for its size, whatever it was. Too fast for a bear, especially in winter. After about an hour of this cat and mouse game, I came across something that stopped me cold. A fallen Douglas fir, about 3 feet thick, had been split open like someone had driven a wedge into it, but there were no axe marks, no saw cuts. The wood had been pried apart, the grain torn and splintered in a way I'd never seen before. Around the break, the bark had been peeled off in long, careful strips, not like a bear shredding for grubs, but methodical, purposeful. I set my rifle down and examined the torn wood closer. The break was fresh, maybe from last night. My fingers traced the splintered edges, feeling the force it must have taken to split such a thick trunk. No human could have done this without tools, and there were no tool marks I could recognize. Moving on, I found more signs. Another log torn apart about 50 yards further up. Then a young pine with bark stripped in a spiral pattern, the exposed wood showing what looked like teeth marks. But larger than any animal I knew. The signs formed a rough line heading up toward the ridgeline, like something working its way through the timber with a purpose. The sun was getting high when I heard 3 more branch snaps, quick in succession, from just over the next rise. I moved forward carefully, but my boot caught a frozen branch hidden under the snow. The crack seemed to echo through the whole valley. Immediately, something large moved in the timber ahead. I could hear brush breaking and snow crunching under, heavy steps. But by the time I crested the rise, whatever it was had vanished. I stood there for a long time, listening to my heart pound and watching my breath steam in the cold air. The forest had gone completely silent again. One of those dead zones that had been haunting my valley. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just the weight of unseen eyes that I could feel but couldn't locate. The sun was past its peak when I finally turned back toward my cabin. My tracks were the only ones visible in the snow, but something had been there. Something strong enough to tear apart logs, smart enough to stay just ahead of me, and careful enough to move without leaving tracks when it wanted to. That night, I made the longest entry yet in my journal. I wrote about everything I'd found. The split logs, the stripped bark, the strange teeth marks. But it was the last line that took me the longest to write. 4 simple words I'd been avoiding for weeks. I am not alone. The storm hit without warning. One moment I was checking my trapline, the next the sky turned the color of a bruise. I barely made it back to the cabin before the first blast of wind hit, driving sheets of snow sideways through the trees. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees, and the wind was screaming across the valley like something alive. I've weathered plenty of storms in my 15 years up here, but this one felt different from the start. The usual comfort of my cabin walls seemed to vanish as darkness fell. Every creak and groan of the timber made me jump, my ears straining to separate natural sounds from something else. The first knocks came around midnight. 3 sharp raps on the west wall, clear even through the howling wind. I grabbed my rifle and waited, heart pounding. 5 minutes later, 3 more knocks from the north side, then the east. It was moving around the cabin, testing each wall. I kept the lantern burning low, not wanting to silhouette myself in the windows. The pacing continued through the night, slow, deliberate steps in the snow that circled my cabin again and again. Sometimes it would stop at a corner for long minutes, as if listening. Then the knocking would start again, always in threes, always moving to a different wall. By dawn of the second day, the storm showed no signs of breaking. The wind piled snow against my doors and windows until only thin strips of grey light filtered through. The knocking had stopped, but I could still hear movement outside. The crunch of snow under heavy feet, branches snapping as something large moved through the timber. The smell hit me around noon. It seeped through the gaps between the logs where the chinking had worked loose, a thick, musty odor like wet fur and something else I couldn't place. Something wild, something old. I'd caught whiffs of it before, but never this strong, never this close. I was dozing in my chair, rifle across my knees, when it happened. A sound that made my blood run cold. The slow drag of fingers across the outer wall, not claws, not branches blown by the wind, but fingers. They started at one corner and moved deliberately along the logs, scraping through the frost-covered wood. I could track the sound as it moved, imagining massive hands exploring my shelter. The dragging stopped at my window. Through the narrow gap between the snow and the sill, I saw something dark block out what little light remained. The musty odor grew overwhelming. I heard deep breathing, slow and controlled, and a soft thumping that might have been a heartbeat, though it could have been my own pulse pounding in my ears. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing, as whatever it was studied my cabin. After what felt like hours, the shadow moved away. But the pacing continued, and the knocking started again as the second night fell. By the third day, I was half mad from lack of sleep. The storm still raged, and the thing outside never seemed to tire. Sometimes it would retreat into the timber, and I'd hear trees cracking in the distance. Then it would return, circling closer, testing my walls with those terrible knocks. The smell had permeated everything. My clothes, my blankets, even my skin seemed to reek of that wild musk. I found myself writing frantically in my journal during the brief periods when it moved away, trying to capture every detail before exhaustion or terror made me forget. The knocks come in patterns now, I wrote, my handwriting barely legible. 3 quick, 2 slow, pause, repeat, like it's trying to communicate. Or maybe I'm losing my mind. The drag marks will prove I'm not crazy. Deep grooves in the wood. Too high for a bear. Too deliberate for anything else I know. When the storm breaks, if it breaks, I'll photograph them. If I last that long. I dozed off sometime in the afternoon of the third day, my head dropping to my chest. I snapped awake to absolute silence. The wind had died. The pacing had stopped. Even the ever-present breathing outside my walls had gone quiet. I sat motionless in my chair, straining to hear anything beyond my own shallow breaths. Then, 3 sharp knocks directly above my head on the cabin's roof. The storm broke just before dawn on the 4th day. I watched through my frosted window as the clouds parted, revealing a sky painted in deep purples and blues. The silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, not even the crunch of snow under unseen feet. For the first time in 3 days, I felt I could breathe. I gathered my gear with trembling hands. Rifle, camera, journal, and a length of cord for measuring. The temperature had dropped well below 0 during the night, turning the fresh snow into a crystalline crust that squeaked under my boots as I stepped outside. The evidence was everywhere. Deep impressions circled my cabin in a methodical pattern, the tracks now frozen solid in the snow. Using my cord, I measured the stride length, nearly 6 feet between prints. The footprints themselves were massive, easily 18 inches long, with distinct toe impressions that made my mouth go dry. But it was the walls of my cabin that told the real story. Long parallel grooves ran horizontally along the logs at a height of nearly 8 feet, exactly where I'd heard those fingers dragging. In some places, the marks had scraped deep enough to expose raw wood beneath the weathered surface. I fumbled, with my disposable camera, hands shaking as I captured what proof I could. The tracks led away from my cabin in several directions, but the clearest trail headed east toward the meadow. Dawn was breaking in earnest now, sending fingers of pale light through the trees. Against my better judgment, I shouldered my rifle and followed. The trail was easy to read in the pristine snow. Whatever made these prints moved with purpose, stepping over fallen logs rather than around them. Occasionally, I found broken branches high up, 9 or 10 feet off the ground, snapped clean as if something large had pushed through. The forest opened suddenly onto the meadow, a white expanse stretching maybe 200 yards to the opposite, tree line. Thin tendrils of fog hugged the snow, creating an otherworldly scene in the growing light. I crouched at the edge of the trees, scanning the open space and the dark wall of forest beyond. That's when I saw them. At first, they were just shadows in the fog, vertical shapes darker than the surrounding mist. But as I watched, they resolved into distinct figures. 4 of them, standing motionless at the far tree line. They were enormous, their heads level with the lower branches of the pines. Even at this distance, I could make out the broad shoulders, the long arms hanging at their sides. They moved as one, stepping forward into better light. Their fur was dark, matted in places with snow and ice. Steam rose from their bodies in the frigid air. I raised my rifle scope for a better look, my hands surprisingly steady now. The largest one turned its head, and for a brief moment, I swear it looked directly at me, not with the dull awareness of a bear or mountain lion, but with intelligence, ancient and aware. Then, as if responding to some silent signal, all four figures turned and melted back into the forest, moving with a fluid grace that belied their size. I sat in the snow for a long time, my mind struggling to process what I'd seen. When I finally returned to my cabin, I wrote feverishly in my journal, trying to capture every detail while it was fresh. They are not solitary, not random wanderers. This is a family group, perhaps even a tribe. The patterns of movement around, my cabin, the coordinated knocking, the way they moved together in the meadow. All of it speaks of organization, of purpose. I've been seeing this valley as mine for 15 years, but I'm beginning to understand a terrible truth. They're not intruding on my territory. I'm living in theirs. This is their valley, maybe has been for centuries, and they're simply reclaiming what was always theirs. I closed my journal and stared out at the pristine snow, knowing it wouldn't stay unmarked for long. The question was no longer whether they existed, but what their presence meant for me, the hermit who had unknowingly built his sanctuary in the heart of their domain. The nights grew longer, darker, heavier with presence. I found myself talking to the shadows more and more, my voice rough from disuse. Sometimes it was anger that spilled out. What do you want from me? This is my home now. Other times, especially in the deepest part of night when the knocking would start, my words became almost pleading. I mean no harm. I have always respected this land. My food stores were dwindling faster than planned. The traps remained empty or sprung, and hunting had become impossible. Every time I raised my rifle, a series of sharp knocks would echo through the trees, warning away any game. I had maybe 2 weeks of provisions left, 3 if I stretched, them thin. The trading post was a 4-day trek in good weather, longer in deep snow. I had made the journey dozens of times over the years, but now the thought of leaving filled me with a nameless dread. What if they followed? The idea of being tracked through the wilderness, of sleeping exposed while those figures moved in the darkness around my camp, made my chest tight with panic. And worse, what if I couldn't come back? The way they had been systematically disrupting my routines, cutting off my food sources. It felt like a message. This valley had been my sanctuary for 15 years, but now every shadow held eyes. Every rustle carried intent. The isolation that had once brought me peace now felt like a trap slowly closing. I stared at my dwindling supplies and the calendar on my wall, knowing a decision would have to be made soon. But for now, I could only sit in my cabin as darkness fell, speaking softly to whatever waited in the night beyond my walls. The crunch of skis on crusty snow made me jolt upright. For a moment, I thought the sounds were something else entirely, but then I caught the flash of a blue uniform through the trees, a Forest Service ranger moving steadily toward my cabin on cross-country skis. I hadn't seen another human in nearly 4 months. My hands shook as I opened the door, suddenly aware of my matted beard and unwashed clothes. The ranger, young and professional, introduced himself with practiced courtesy, explaining he was doing routine checks on backcountry structures. "Everything all right up here, sir? You seem a bit on edge." His eyes darted around my cabin, taking in the rifle by the door, the obsessively detailed journal pages scattered across my table. I found myself spilling out the story, the tracks, the knocking, the figures in the meadow. With each detail, his expression grew more concerned, though not in the way I'd hoped. He was looking at me like I was coming undone, another hermit lost to isolation. "I have proof," I said, grabbing the disposable camera. "The tracks in the snow, I measured them, photographed them." He took the camera carefully, maintaining his professional demeanor. "I'll get these developed when I'm back in town," he said. But sir, winter isolation can play tricks on the mind. Maybe consider coming down to civilization for a while. I knew that tone, the gentle patronizing of someone handling what they perceived as delusion. But when he studied the snowshoe prints around my cabin, something flickered across his face. Unease. He made careful notes in his logbook, measuring distances between strides. Later, I would learn his official report mentioned inconclusive anomalies in the snow patterns and resident displaying signs of environmental stress, bureaucratic language that neither confirmed nor denied what was really happening in my valley. After the ranger disappeared down the valley, the weight of my isolation pressed heavier than before. Someone had finally heard my story, seen my evidence, and still walked away thinking I was just another mountain crazy. I watched his ski tracks slowly fill with fresh snow until they vanished completely. That night, the response came. The first stone hit the tin roof at midnight. Not the usual tentative tapping, but a deliberate slam that echoed through my cabin like a gunshot. Then another, and another. The impacts grew more frequent, more forceful, as if punishing me for breaking some unspoken rule by speaking to the ranger. I huddled in my chair, rifle across my knees, regretting every word I'd shared. The creatures had been watching, listening. Now they knew I'd tried to expose them. Each thunderous strike seemed to say, "This is what happens when you talk." The barrage continued for hours, denting my roof in dozens of places. By dawn, my floor was littered with splinters of wood knocked loose from the rafters. I understood the message clearly. I had violated whatever careful balance existed between us, and now they were showing me exactly what they thought about: outside interference. The first snow of winter came early this year, sealing me into my valley like a tomb. But I wasn't alone anymore. They made sure I knew that. Every day, they tightened their circle around my cabin, leaving signs of their surveillance that I couldn't ignore. Their communication became more sophisticated, or maybe I was just learning to recognize it better. It would start with a sharp knock from the ridge to the north, answered by another from the southern slope. Sometimes 3 or 4 different locations would join in, creating a conversation I could track but never understand. The sound would bounce between the valleys, precise and purposeful. The worst was when they mimicked me. I used to whistle while checking my traps, an old habit from happier days. Now they echo it back, the melody distorted and wrong, like a record played too slow. They've learned my routines, my signals, my very presence. At night, I feel it, most deep, rhythmic thumping that vibrates through the ground and into my chest cavity. It's not sound exactly, more like pressure waves that make my ribs ache. Sleep has become impossible. I lie awake, listening to them coordinate their movements around my cabin, knowing they're watching, waiting. For what, I'm afraid to guess. My hands shake as I write this, making the letters sprawl across the page like broken spider legs. I've filled 3 journals now with their shapes, dark silhouettes against the tree line, always taller than seems possible. The same figures appear in my sketches over and over, though I can't remember drawing half of them. Sometimes I wake to find I've written the same words repeatedly: watching, waiting, ancient ones. The supplies I traded for last month still sit in their burlap sacks by the door. I've wedged every chair and table I own against the entrance. The thought of stepping outside, even to gather firewood, makes my throat close up. They know I'm weakening. I can sense their patience wearing thin. Last night, I heard something heavy drag itself across my roof, and their musk seeped through every crack in the logs. My lantern's running low on oil, but the darkness feels safer now. They've been here so long, longer than any of us. This valley was never mine. I was just borrowing it. In what might be my final entry, I need to record the truth. They're not just passing through, not just one creature, but many. And they're close now, so close I can hear them breathing. The search party found my body on March 15th, after the winter's grip had finally loosened. Sheriff Dale Thompson's report noted the cabin door was still barred from the inside, chairs and tables piled against it like a fortress wall. They had to break through a window to reach me. My journals, 13 notebooks filled with increasingly frantic observations, were collected as evidence, along with the disposable camera and 3 microcassette tapes I'd used to record the nighttime knocks. The county coroner listed natural causes on my death certificate, though Deputy Wilson later admitted they couldn't explain the strange prints circling the cabin's perimeter, preserved in the crusted snow. The evidence disappeared into some government filing cabinet. My photographs, recordings, and desperate written warnings were sealed away, deemed too disturbing or perhaps too revealing for public eyes. But word spreads in small mountain towns. Hunters still talk about the rhythmic knocking that echoes through that valley at dusk, always in sets of 3. Loggers refuse contracts there, claiming the air feels thick with watching eyes. Those who know the truth whisper it like a prayer. Some parts of the wilderness keep their own guardians. What sleeps in those ancient forests was never meant to be discovered. My solitude awakened something that should have remained hidden. Thank you for being part of this moment. I'll be here tomorrow, ready to share another story that comforts the soul.